Imagine a country where, you know, female youth literacy is nearly 100%.
Right. Almost perfect parity.
Yeah, and life expectancy totally rivals the developed world, and the currency is literally the rock-solid US dollar.
You'd think you're looking at a global economic superpower, honestly.
You really would. But today, we are looking at a nation where half of that brilliant, super healthy workforce is trapped in the informal street economy.
It's quite the paradox.
It really is. So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're opening up this fascinating 15-page academic diagnostic report.
And it is dense. It's based on over 6 decades of World Bank development indicators.
Right, so we are looking at data stretching from 1960 all the way to 2023. And the subject of this massive profile is the nation of Ecuador.
The contradictions in that data profile are really what make Ecuador such an amazing subject. I mean, for anyone interested in macroeconomics or global development or just, the mechanics of how nations actually function.
Exactly, because you have this massive accumulation of human capital sitting right side by side with deep structural bottlenecks.
Yeah, if we had to give an elevator pitch for this slide deck, it's that Ecuador has basically reached a crossroads. They are shifting from a period of quantity-driven growth to a desperate need for quality-driven development.
I want to speak directly to you, the listener, as we get into this.
Yeah.
You might be wondering, well, why should I care about the macroeconomic history of Ecuador?
It's a fair question.
It is. But the reason is that Ecuador's journey over the last half-century is basically the perfect laboratory for understanding the modern world.
Oh, absolutely.
We're going to explore a country that endured the absolute psychological terror of hyperinflation, took the radical step of totally abandoning its own sovereign currency.
Which is a huge deal.
Massive deal. And then they tried to leapfrog straight into a modern service economy, all while managing some of the most critical ecological resources on the planet.
This really isn't just a story about one nation. It is a masterclass in the friction between human potential and economic structure.
Okay, so let's unpack this. And I actually want to start just by looking at the cover of this report, page 1, because it really sets the tone.
It does, yeah. It's very striking.
It's this minimalist, stark white background.
Yeah.
And right in the center, there's just a flat, geometric, abstract version of the Ecuadorian flag.
No bright colors, just serious, non-serif fonts. It screams, heavy professional academic analysis.
Totally. And that serious tone carries right into page 2, which tackles the engine of any nation, right? It's people.
Right, the demographic dynamic. And demographers use this specific term, the demographic dividend,
Right.
which basically refers to a unique window in a nation's history where the population structure changes in a mathematically highly advantageous way.
So breaking that down, the World Bank data from 1960 shows Ecuador's working age population.
Meaning people between the ages of 15 and 64?
Right. That group made up roughly 51.5% of the total population back then.
It's barely half.
Which means for every person out there working, farming, building something, there was another person, mostly young kids, who needed to be fed and educated, but wasn't producing economic output.
Precisely. The dependency ratio was incredibly high. But over the next 6 decades, if you look at the stacked area chart in the report, that structure completely transformed.
It's a huge shift.
By 2023, that working age demographic had surged to 66.6%.
Two-thirds of the country.
Exactly. 2/3 is now in that prime working window. Meanwhile, the dependency ratio, driven mostly by a drop in children under 14, just plummeted.
I always like to think of this demographic shift like a rowboat.
Okay, I like that.
It's like, you used to have a boat where half the people were passengers needing to be rowed, and now suddenly 2/3 of the boat has picked up an oar.
Right. The potential speed of that boat is incredible now.
Exactly. When you have that many people generating surplus value, it changes the national metabolic rate. But there is a catch hidden in this chart, right?
There is, yeah. The data reveals a slow but vital lag effect. The demographic window is wide open right now, but the report points out with this little circle on the chart that the 65 and older population is creeping up. In 1960, they were just 4.6% of the population. By 2023, that metric had grown to 8.1%.
So the hinges on that window of opportunity are visibly starting to close.
Exactly. The workforce is eventually going to age out. So if a nation doesn't accumulate massive wealth during this specific window, they face the risk of growing old before they grow rich.
Okay, so the window is open now. But raw population numbers don't automatically mean a booming economy.
No, definitely not.
I mean, if we have all these new workers picking up an oar, what are they equipped with? Did the educational system actually catch this massive wave of youth?
Well, according to page 8 of the report, on a quantitative level, they didn't just catch them, they completely transformed them.
The human capital boom is just staggering.
It really is. Look at the bar chart comparing historical female youth literacy, tracking women ages 15 to 24. In 1982, it was already a respectable 92.3%.
Which is pretty good.
But the recent data, it rocketed to 99.3%.
Wait, 99.3, that is basically total literacy.
Almost perfect. And getting to that number fundamentally rewrites the fabric of a labor market.
Yeah, because when young women are fully literate, they tend to delay marriage, they have fewer but healthier children, and they enter the formal workforce demanding better wages.
Exactly. And the report goes even deeper into that structural redesign using the Gender Parity Index, or GPI.
Which measures the ratio of girls to boys enrolled in school, right?
Right, where a score of 1.0 is perfect parity. The trend line for primary and secondary enrollment shows the GPI in Ecuador hasn't just reached 1.0, it has stabilized above it.
Meaning women are actually leading in educational access now.
Yes, they are structurally out-enrolling men. It means the talent pool available to employers has effectively doubled in quality over a single generation.
But, I mean, there's a physical reality to educating that many people, right?
Yeah.
If millions of new students flood the system, usually the infrastructure just buckles.
And we do see evidence of that early strain in the data on page 9. In the 1970s, the primary school student-to-teacher ratio was a highly crowded 37 to 1.
Wow, 37 kids to one teacher. That's basically just crowd control at that point.
Exactly. You can't teach advanced problem solving when you're just trying to keep 37 kids in their seats. But the contemporary data shows that ratio has dropped down to 24 to 1.
And there's a chart showing government education expenditure hitting a historical high, right?
Yeah, that physical investment really paid off. The hardware is in place. The next challenge isn't getting kids into seats, it's the depth and quality of what they learn.
Which transitions perfectly into the health data on page 10, because education and health are always so deeply linked.
Oh, totally. The public health achievements here are massive. Life expectancy jumped from just 53 years back in 1960.
At 53, that's devastating economically.
Right, you lose your most experienced workers right at their peak. But today it has soared to 77.9 years.
That's adding a quarter century of life to the average citizen.
And a major driver of that is the steep plunge in under-5 child mortality shown on the trend line graph.
And they supported that by massively scaling medical resources, right?
Exactly. Page 11 has a step chart showing the number of doctors per 1,000 people grew from 0.4 in 1960 to 2.3 today.
Okay, so let's synthesize this. You have a massive, highly literate, gender-equal, and super healthy workforce ready to go.
A tightly coiled spring.
Right. You'd think the economy would just be an unstoppable rocket ship. But where are they actually working? Because that spring doesn't seem to release into the corporate sector.
And that is the paradox at the heart of page 13. We move from these huge triumphs in human capital right into the deep structural flaws of the labor market.
So what does the data actually say about employment?
Well, while female labor participation has consistently risen, there's a massive structural issue. Roughly 50% of the total labor force is trapped in what economists call vulnerable employment.
Wait, hold on. You just told me youth literacy is at 99.3%, and the population is the healthiest it's ever been.
Yeah.
How can half the workforce still be in vulnerable, non-formal jobs? Because vulnerable employment means the informal sector, right?
Exactly. It's non-wage labor. No social security, no legal recourse, gig workers operating in cash.
So they can't get a mortgage, they can't get a business loan. It's just day-to-day survival.
Right. And to understand why, we have to look at the macroeconomic structure on page 4. They experience what we call a skipped industrialization.
Skipped industrialization.
Yeah. Over the decades, as people left agriculture and moved to cities, the slack wasn't picked up by a massive industrial boom.
Usually you'd expect a boom in factories, right? Low-end manufacturing, sweatshops moving up to higher-end stuff.
Right, standard developmental theory. But here, manufacturing has flatlined. It's stubbornly stuck at around 13% of GDP since 2015.
So they just skipped the factory phase entirely.
Pretty much. Instead, Ecuador leaps straight into a service-driven economy, which now makes up roughly 57% of the GDP.
But when people hear service economy, they picture, tech firms and investment banks.
And those exist, but it creates a dual economy. You have a tiny tier of high-end formal services and a massive tier of low-end informal survival services on the street.
The street vendor selling phone cases is technically in the service sector.
Exactly.
Okay, but to understand why industry didn't take off, we have to look at the massive economic trauma Ecuador survived at the turn of the millennium.
The monetary crisis of the late 90s?
Yeah. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you look at the logarithmic charts on page 7 regarding inflation,
It's alarming.
it's absolutely terrifying. In 1999 and 2000, Ecuador experienced this devastating hyperinflation. The GDP deflator growth rate hit an astronomical 96%.
A 96% inflation rate completely destroys the concept of the future.
Right. Imagine running a bakery. You buy flour on Monday, sell bread on Tuesday, and by Wednesday, the money you made is worth half as much.
You can't save, businesses can't set prices, foreign investors just flee.
So the desperation must have been absolute, because the medicine they took to fix it was radical.
They executed full dollarization. In 2000, they completely abandoned their local currency, the sucre, and adopted the US dollar.
Which is basically throwing your hands up and surrendering your monetary sovereignty to Washington.
It is. But we have to look at the trade-off. On one hand, it worked brilliantly for price stability. Post-2010, inflation flatlined to a highly predictable 0 to 3% range.
But by dollarizing, they surrender their monetary policy. They can't print money or devalue their currency to absorb external shocks.
Exactly. And that answers your question about why manufacturing flatlined. Because they use the strong US dollar, their exports are priced at a premium.
So they can't artificially weaken their currency to make their factories globally competitive like other developing nations do.
Precisely. They price themselves out of the very industrialization process that would have provided formal jobs.
So they're bolted to the dollar, which means they're highly sensitive to global tides.
And you see that volatility on page 5, tracking domestic savings and total fixed capital formation.
Right, the physical investment in the country.
There was a massive peak in the mid-2000s, exceeding 25% of GDP. But it wasn't driven by domestic policy. It was driven by the global commodity supercycle.
So as an oil exporter, they were just riding that wave.
Yeah, but when the external environment soured post-2014, there's a really noticeable downward trend.
Because they lack that monetary shock absorber.
Exactly. But despite all that, the aggregate GDP per capita data on page 3 shows remarkable resilience. They did see leapfrog wealth generation overall.
True, but the vulnerability is still there. Look at the data for 2020. Per capita GDP took a massive dive from about $6,237 down to $5,586.
Right, the pandemic shock. And because they couldn't just print money to stimulate the economy, they took the full hit directly.
They did bounce back in 2021 and 2022, but it just highlights their external fragility. Especially when you look at page 6. Trading goods and services rebounded to a high of 53% of GDP by 2022.
Meaning they are a highly open economy, super dependent on international trade.
And the current account balance is in this constant, fragile state of oscillation. Huge swings, like the massive dip around 2008.
So they are incredibly exposed.
Okay, so let's summarize the board here. You have a dollarized economy, super stable on prices, but completely exposed to global commodity shocks.
Right.
You have an educated workforce, but half are in the informal sector because you skipped industrialization. If you can't control your currency to protect your economy, the only way left to attract foreign capital is through incredibly strong domestic institutions.
Absolute legal certainty.
Right. Do they have them?
Well, that brings us to the governance gap on page 12. They use a radar chart based on the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI.
And that chart is super asymmetrical.
It is. In voice and accountability, Ecuador actually has a distinct regional advantage. Democratic participation is robust.
But the other metrics show deep struggles. I'm looking at government effectiveness, and it hit a low point of negative 1.03 in the early 2000s.
It recovered slightly, but institutional building, rule of law, and controlling corruption remain their most critical vulnerabilities.
And without that strong rule of law, foreign investment stays totally volatile. A tech company isn't going to build a billion-dollar plant if they think a contract won't be honored next year.
Exactly. Capital seeks safety. And this weak institutional framework doesn't just stall the economy, it avidly harms the environment.
Yeah. Page 14 really highlights the physical cost of this growth. It's a stark trade-off. Forest area has shrunk significantly.
The dual-axis chart shows it dropping from about 146,000 square kilometers in 1990 down to roughly 123,000 today.
Because when half the workforce is in vulnerable employment, they clear forests for subsistence farming or unregulated mining just to survive.
It's ecological liquidation to subsidize the lack of formal jobs.
It's basically a tug of war. On one side, you're literally burning the furniture to heat the house deforestation.
Yeah.
But on the other side, the report shows this incredible green potential. The area chart for renewable electricity output shows it hitting a high of 80% at one point.
Mostly hydroelectric. They have the natural geography to be a clean energy superpower.
The foundation is totally there for a green transition. But again, it needs institutional stability to attract the capital to lock it in.
Which brings us to the final section of the report, page 15, the crossroads.
Right. So what does this all mean? When the authors look at this whole 60-year picture, how do they suggest Ecuador solve this massive puzzle?
They lay out a very clear logic map. First, the assets. A prime demographic dividend, incredibly high youth literacy, and low inflation thanks to dollarization.
But the liabilities are heavy. Unstable governance, ecological degradation, and an economy overly reliant on services with half the workforce informal.
So the report outlines 3 core policy pillars. Number 1, optimize institutions. They urgently need to elevate the rule of law and anti-corruption measures to stabilize the investment climate.
You have to fix the foundation first. What's pillar 2?
Green transition. Aggressively halt deforestation while stabilizing and expanding that highly promising renewable energy supply.
Okay, and the third pillar, because this one really jumped out at me. The report calls it quality elevation, basically addressing the R&D gap.
This is the real bottleneck. To escape the middle-income trap, Ecuador has to convert its highly educated population into high-tech output.
And the statistic here is just staggering. After everything we talked about, the literacy, the health, their research and development expenditure is currently a mere 0.44% of GDP.
Less than 0.5%. You can't just have literate workers who read manuals. You need innovators who write the manuals.
Exactly. If you don't fund R&D, you squander the demographic dividend. The engineers will just leave for countries that do fund research.
Brain drain is a huge risk here. But if they can fix the institutions, attract capital, and pump it into R&D and green energy, they could forge a high-tech green economy.
Which would finally pull that 50% out of the informal sector.
Precisely.
Wow. So to wrap this up, the uniqueness of Ecuador's position is just absolute. They survived hyperinflation, built a highly educated populace, and kept a stable currency.
But they are at the exact turning point between quantity-driven growth and quality-driven development.
Which brings up a really provocative thought to leave you with. We saw earlier that the 65 and older population is slowly rising, currently at 8.1%.
That demographic window is mathematically finite. It is going to close.
Right. So if Ecuador cannot solve its governance issues and raise that dismal 0.44% R&D investment soon, what happens when that window officially closes?
Will they face the ultimate developmental trap, getting old before they manage to get rich?
It's a heavy question. And it's exactly why this data matters. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I really encourage you to go look at the raw World Bank data yourself. Look at how these invisible structural shifts, demographics, inflation anchors, human capital are shaping the future of nations right now.